As I sit here today, holding my child, I feel trapped in the same cycle of poverty I tried so hard to escape. I hated my parents for bringing me into this world of suffering, and now I've done the same to my child. Sometimes I whisper those words. I wish I was never born. But maybe, just maybe, I can still break this curse. For my child. For myself. But how? Life has always been cruel to me. From the moment I entered this world, I've known nothing but hardship and misery. Born into a family drowning in poverty, my earliest memories were of empty stomachs and cold nights. My parents worked endlessly, but no matter how hard they tried, we were always behind on rent, always struggling to eat, always stuck in poverty. I used to ask my parents, "Why did you bring me into this world if you couldn't provide for me?" My words hurt them, but the pain inside me was worse. I blamed them for my suffering, for the hunger, the shame, the endless cycle of poverty. I couldn't understand why they chose to bring me into such misery. Nights were the worst. Lying awake in the dark, I would cry and ask God why he let me be born. Growing up, I promised myself and swore I would escape this cycle of suffering, no matter what it took. I'd find a way to live a better life, to be happy. Then I met Luciano. We met when I was in my early 20s, at a local restaurant where he worked as a waiter. He was kind, hardworking, and just as poor as I was. It wasn't long before we started dating. Luciano and I shared the same struggles. He understood the struggles of poverty because he lived them too. There were days when we couldn't afford food, nights when we'd sit in his tiny apartment, dreaming of a better life. We held each other through every disappointment and promised we'd rise above it all, together. He had dreams of a better future, and his determination inspired me. Together, we dreamed of a better life. I loved Luciano with all my heart. He made me feel seen, valued, and loved in a way I'd never experienced before. We often talked about the future, how we'd save up, build a life together, and finally leave the shadows of poverty behind. I believed in him and I stood by him. One day, Luciano went to the supermarket to buy groceries and decided, on a whim, to buy a lottery ticket. Neither of us had ever considered ourselves lucky, but this time, luck smiled on him. Luciano's life changed forever, but I didn't know it. Luciano had won the mega jackpot, $20 million. The first person Luciano told wasn't me. It was his older brother, Franco. Luciano was ecstatic. "I'm finally free of poverty," he exclaimed. "I can give her the life she deserves. She stood by me when I had nothing. She loved me for who I am, not for what I could give her. I'm going to propose to her. I'm going to use this money to give her the life she deserves." But Franco wasn't convinced. He planted a seed of doubt in Luciano's mind. "You think she loves you unconditionally. But how do you know? What if she's not as loyal as you think? She's only been with you because she didn't have better options. If a rich man had come along, she would have left you without thinking twice." Luciano defended me at first. He shook his head and said, "No, she's loyal. I know she loves me." But Franco kept pushing, and he convinced him to test me. "Then test her," Franco insisted. "Don't tell her about the lottery or your plans to propose until you're sure. Only those who've been tested can be trusted. Give her a chance to leave you for someone better. Only then will you know if she's loyal." Reluctantly, Luciano agreed. Luciano and Franco devised a plan to test my loyalty. He used part of his winnings to hire a man named Donald to act as a wealthy suitor. Donald was everything Luciano wasn't: rich, flashy, and confident. His job was to tempt me and see if I would abandon Luciano for a life of luxury. I had no idea any of this was happening. To me, Luciano was still the same hard-working, struggling man I had always known. I first met Donald at the supermarket. He approached me while I was checking out and offered to pay for my groceries. "No, thank you," I said politely. "You're too beautiful to be paying for your own groceries," he replied with a charming smile. I declined again and left, but Donald wasn't done. He was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against a sleek luxury car. It was clear he wanted me to notice him. That night, I told Luciano about the encounter. "Some guy at the supermarket tried to talk to me," I said. "He's rich, good-looking, and persistent, but I'm not interested." Luciano just shrugged. "Don't worry about it," he said casually. His lack of reaction surprised me, but I brushed it off. Donald didn't give up. He started showing up everywhere, at the park, outside my workplace, even at the coffee shop I visited every morning. It felt like he was following me. I told Luciano about it, hoping he'd step in, but he seemed uninterested. "Just ignore him," he said. I didn't know it then, but Luciano was watching me closely. One day, Luciano came to me looking sad and broken. "My mother needs surgery," he said, "but I don't have the money to pay for it." His words broke my heart. Seeing his pain, I was determined to help. I took on extra shifts, working day and night, and even took on a second job. I was desperate to raise money for his mother's surgery. I turned to my best friend, Casey, hoping she could lend me some money. "Please," I begged her. "I need to borrow money for Luciano's mom. She needs surgery." "It's urgent." Casey looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you out of your mind?" she said. "Why are you killing yourself for a man who has nothing? You've suffered your whole life, and now you're willing to suffer more for a poor man? Dump him and go for Donald. He's rich, and he clearly likes you. The universe has smiled at you by bringing Donald your way, and here you are, being foolish by pushing him away. If you won't date him, at least ask him for the money." Her words echoed in my mind as I stared at my reflection that night. Was she right? Was I holding myself back by staying loyal to a man who could barely take care of himself, let alone me? One day, Donald handed me an envelope filled with money. "I don't know what's going on in your life," he said, "but you look like someone who could use some help. Take this. It's yours. No strings attached." I was stunned. How did he know I needed money? I hadn't told him anything. What I didn't know was that Casey, my best friend, had told Donald everything. Casey found out I was being tested because she overheard it from her friend, who happened to be Franco's girlfriend. She kept the information to herself because she had her own selfish motives. She never liked my boyfriend and had always discouraged my relationship with Luciano. But when she heard about the lottery jackpot and Luciano's sudden wealth, she suddenly became interested in him. She began scheming, hoping I would fail the test so she could have Luciano for herself. Casey played the perfect friend to my face, but behind my back, she secretly hoped I would fall for Donald's advances and ruin my relationship. After Donald handed me the envelope of money, I was hesitant to accept it. I hadn't told him I needed money, so his gesture seemed both suspicious and overwhelming. "I don't understand," I said, holding the envelope as if it might burn me. "Why are you giving me this?" "You've mentioned before that you've had a rough life," Donald said smoothly, with an almost rehearsed sincerity. "I just want to help you. No strings attached." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. A part of me felt uneasy, but another part, the desperate, struggling part, wanted to believe that someone could be this generous without expecting anything in return. I wanted to refuse, but the thought of my boyfriend's mother lying in pain and in need of urgent surgery pushed me to accept. This money could save her life, I said to myself. I convinced myself that it was a selfless act of kindness from Donald, even if it felt too good to be true. Against my better judgment, I accepted the money. A few days later, Donald called me. He sounded calm and polite, saying he wanted to talk and apologize if his gesture had made me uncomfortable. "I just want to clear the air," he said. "I didn't mean to overstep, and I'd feel better if we could talk in person. Please come to my house. I promise this isn't anything weird." At first I hesitated. Something about it felt off. But he sounded so sincere. I was also grateful for the money, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful by refusing his invitation. After much internal debate, I decided to go. I told myself it would be a quick visit, just to hear him out and thank him properly for his generosity. Little did I know, stepping into that house would be the beginning of the end for everything I held dear. When I arrived at Donald's house, I was struck by the sheer luxury of it. The marble floors gleamed, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a palace. He greeted me at the door with his usual charm, dressed impeccably and wearing a warm smile. I sat down awkwardly, feeling out of place in such opulence. He poured me a drink and handed it to me. "Relax," he said. "I just wanted to apologize if my gesture came across as inappropriate. I really admire you, and I hate seeing you struggle." I sipped the drink, trying to calm my nerves. His words seemed genuine, and for a brief moment, I let my guard down. We talked for a while, mostly about general things: work, life, struggles. He was charming and attentive, but something about the situation still felt off. After finishing the drink, I started to feel lightheaded. My vision blurred, and my body felt heavy. I tried to stand up, but my legs gave out. "What's happening to me?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Don't worry," Donald said, his voice suddenly cold and detached. "You'll be fine." That was the last thing I remembered. I woke up the next morning in a strange bed, my head pounding and my body aching. It took a moment to realize where I was. Donald's bedroom. My clothes were disheveled and I felt sick to my stomach. I scrambled to get dressed, my heart racing as I pieced together what must have happened. I had no memory of the night before, but the implications were clear. Donald was nowhere to be found, so I grabbed my things and rushed out of the house. The ride home felt like a nightmare. My thoughts raced. What just happened? Did he... Later that day, I mustered the courage to call Donald. My hands shook as I dialed his number. "Donald," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened last night? Did you drug me?" "Don't be ridiculous," he replied casually, as if nothing had happened. "You drank a little too much and fell asleep. That's all." "You're lying," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Something happened, and you know it. Tell me the truth." His tone turned cold. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. If you have a problem, that's on you. Don't call me again." He hung up, leaving me in a whirlwind of confusion and anger. Desperate for support, I turned to my best friend, Casey. I poured out the whole story, from Donald giving me the money to waking up in his bed. Her reaction shocked me. "You can't tell Luciano," she said bluntly. "What? Why not?" I asked, confused. "Because he'll never believe you," she said. "You'll just make things worse. Look, what happened happened. Just move on." Her words stung. I had come to her for comfort and advice, but all she offered was cold indifference. "I can't just move on," I said. "This isn't something you just forget." "You have no proof," she said. "If you tell Luciano, it'll only ruin your relationship. Just keep quiet." Her words felt wrong, but I was too broken to argue. 2 days later, Donald called me again. This time, his tone was different, calm and apologetic. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said. "I feel terrible about everything. Can you come over? I want to make things right." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay away, but I also wanted answers. Reluctantly, I agreed. When I arrived at his house, I knew something was wrong. As soon as I stepped inside, I saw Luciano, Franco, Cassie, and Donald sitting in the living room, their expressions cold and unwelcoming. "What's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. Luciano stood up, his face filled with anger and betrayal. He threw a stack of photos at my feet, photos of me in Donald's bed. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice shaking. I froze, unable to speak. The room spun as I stared at the incriminating photos. I don't know how these— "Don't lie to me," Luciano shouted. "You betrayed me. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I turned to Casey, hoping for support, but she smirked. "I told you she wasn't worth it," she said to Luciano. "What are you talking about?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. Luciano revealed everything: the lottery win, the test, Donald's role in it. "This was all a setup," he said. "Donald was supposed to test your loyalty. The cars, the house, they're all mine. This was a test, and you failed." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You did this to me?" I asked, looking at Luciano. "You set me up? Why would you do that?" "To see if you were loyal," Franco interjected. I turned to Casey. "Did you know about this?" She smiled, a cruel glint in her eyes. "Of course I knew. And I'm glad you failed. Luciano deserves better, someone like me." The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. "Have you two been seeing each other behind my back?" Luciano looked away, but Casey answered, "Yes, we've been together for weeks. You don't deserve him." Luciano threw me out of the house that night. Weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant. After I gave birth, a paternity test confirmed the baby wasn't Luciano's but Donald's. Luciano married Casey shortly after, and I was left to raise my child alone. Donald disappeared, and there was no way to contact him. As I sit here today, holding my child, I feel trapped in the same cycle of poverty I tried so hard to escape. I hated my parents for bringing me into this world of suffering, and now I've done the same to my child. Sometimes I whisper those words. I wish I was never born. But maybe, just maybe, I can still break this curse. For my child. For myself. But how?